Hello, my name is Nicole Sherman, and today I'm going to be discussing Russian aggression in Ukraine as my international conflict. Before we can truly understand the rationale behind this conflict and its impacts, we have to explore a little bit of the history between these two countries. As early as the 9th century, Ukraine began to show an early rise to Slavic power in the region. However, in the 13th century, Mongol invaders put a stop to this rise and Slavic power shifted north into Russia. Here we get to see the first source of animosity between these two territories. Ukraine is rich in natural resources such as lush farmlands, making it a major grain producer and coining the term the breadbasket of Europe. This makes it a desirable prize, especially for the mostly cold taiga and tundra regions of Russia. As you can see according to this map, Russia's primary agricultural activities are all localized westward near Ukraine because that is where all the plentiful resources are. Much of the rest of the region is not cultivated in Russia because of the climate and type of biome. Aside from its fertile lands, Ukraine is also loaded with coal and other natural resources for the growth of industry, making it all the more desirable for the taking. So because of its rich wealth and central location, the sovereignty of Ukraine has been disputed for centuries. The Ukrainian people have been desperate for their own independent nation, but over the centuries, Ukraine has been carved up on a continual basis by competing powers. The next powers to carve up Ukraine are the Polish and Lithuanian kingdoms who defeated the Mongols. Most of Ukraine gets divided up between the two, and it is because of these foreign powers that 2 centuries later, the Cossacks uprise against them and turn to Russia for a treaty of protection. After several treaties failed and the war with the Polish kingdoms continued, the final decision was to divide the nation, which split Ukrainian territory between the Commonwealth and Russia. It is here that we first get to see how centuries ago Ukraine fell under Russian control and how that affects the current situation. But protection does not last for long. Instead, it is given in exchange for Tsarist rule. The Cossacks now target their uprisings toward the Russians, but they are eventually destroyed. But let's flash forward to our current situation and see how the next few centuries in Ukrainian-Russian history leading up to today have affected what is going on in this international conflict. In the years after 1917, Ukraine gains its first independence after the collapse of the Russian Empire, but this is short-lived. It is quickly absorbed into the Soviet Union. But it is the years leading up to and through World War II that will have the greatest impact on recent memory for the Ukrainian people and how they perceive Russia. In the early 1930s, Joseph Stalin attempts to force peasants into joining collective farms, and he orchestrates a man-made famine starving millions of Ukrainians to death. This will leave a very bitter taste in the memory of the Ukrainian people. Afterwards, Stalin imports large numbers of Russians and other Soviet citizens, many who have no ability to speak Ukrainian and have no ties to the region, to help repopulate the East. This will become a major factor in the current dispute. To make matters worse, an attempt to Russify the people occurs once again, but this time under Stalin. This happened once before as well in the 18th century when Ukrainian writers and intellectuals became determined to revive the Ukrainian linguistic and cultural traditions and reestablish a Ukrainian nation state. Fearing this kind of separatism, Russia imposed strict limits on any attempt to elevate the Ukrainian language or its culture, even banning its use and study twice in a policy called Russification. Stalin in 1937 began a campaign to execute and deport Ukraine of its intellectuals, writers, and artists, to purge Ukraine of its culture. These people would not normally be considered what you might say dangerous, for they were not soldiers or leaders. They were simply artists and intellectuals. However, they were dangerous enough to the Russians because they meant to preserve the Ukrainian culture. This will become a relevant and deciding sticking point in the current situation. Here we can see a map of the region reflecting the current divide among Ukraine. This map is commonly used as an indicator to show how native Russians or Russian-speaking people have a desire to return back to Mother Russia. Here we have clearly illustrated for us those who voted for the Western-leaning Tymoshenko and those who voted for the Russian-supporting Yanukovych. Yanukovych is the one who eventually wins the election, and this is where our conflict begins. However, in light of the repeated use of Russification and the orchestrated influx of Soviets into the region over the years, one can clearly see how this map is skewed and how the Ukrainian people view the claims of native Russians. Native Ukrainians have in recent memory how those native Russians or Russian-speaking people came to be there in the first place through Stalin, and why there are so many Russian-speaking natives in the area is all because of the forced Russification and denial of the Ukrainian language and culture. To further drive perceptions of Ukrainian people about Russia, World War II had a devastating effect on the region with great loss and devastation as millions of Ukrainians died fighting the Nazis, and over 1 million Ukrainian Jews were killed. Countless more were killed, forced out, and their property stolen from them by the Russians. Here is a map of the region in 1938, and here is a map of the same region from 1945. It is clear when comparing these two maps that as the war progressed, the Russians took the opportunity to take more of the region for themselves. Ukrainians were forced to fight a two-front war from the opposing Nazis to the west and from the aggressive Russians taking as they will from the east. After the war, Russia is forced to annex land to Ukraine, and Ukraine even receives Crimea as a surprised gift. But Russia's presence and influence never leaves. This annexation of land shows us Ukraine's current borders and how it's got its shape that is now in dispute. Ukraine finally gains its independence in 1991 because of the revival of Ukrainian writers and intellectuals once again, but the cost of freedom is high and tensions between Ukraine and its former ruler now run very deep. Ukrainian expert Adrian Karnecki states the biggest divide of all these factors is between those who view the Russian imperial and Soviet rule more sympathetically versus those who see them as a tragedy. The analysis given thus far and the evidence contributed for us to investigate are all a demonstration of the foreign policy analysis theory using multiple disciplines to investigate an international conflict. We have looked at multiple disciplines including historical context, military strategy, economic reasons. We've looked at geography, including natural resources and biomes. And we've also looked at some social context, including culture and language, and how all of these things are affecting the current international crisis in Ukraine. The crisis began in November when Ukraine's then president, Yanukovych, had turned his back on a trade deal with the EU and accepted a $15 billion bailout from Moscow under Russian pressure. The announcement was made suddenly in exchange to revive economic ties with Moscow, something that Yanukovych's loyal Russian supporters from the East wanted. Yanukovych and Putin meet several times, and Putin agrees to buy out Ukrainian debt and slash the price of Russian gas supplies to the Ukraine, as well as inject the economy with fresh billions of dollars in cash. This enrages many Ukrainian people, and they begin demonstrating on Independence Square for several months. Many lose their lives in clashes with police as they call for Yanukovych's resignation. But the unrest continues as the Ukrainian people continue to protest, suspicious of the strategic partnership growing between Yanukovych and Putin. Many demonstrators are killed, and many opposing leaders are jailed. Finally, in February, Ukraine's parliament votes to remove Yanukovych from office, who flees to Russia for refuge. Ukraine names a new government, and this enrages Russia, who puts 150,000 troops on high alert. Armed men seize the Crimea parliament and raise the Russian flag. They eventually seize all of Crimea and grow increasingly hostile to Ukrainian troops trapped in bases. Putin celebrates the return of Crimea to the motherland. Tug and pull between these two nations throughout history demonstrates both realism and liberalism. Realism is evidenced in a couple of ways. First, most obviously, by the drive of survival of Ukraine and its effort to protect its sovereignty. Next, it is most drastically evidenced in the push for power of Russia in trying to take the sovereignty of Ukraine. Liberalism is most evidenced in the current situation in Ukraine and its desire for full independence, wanting its desire to make an independent, individual choice to join NATO or the EU, and its desire to be able to maintain its own cultural identity and language. The conflict between native-speaking Russians and native Ukrainians is also evidenced in this liberalism because they both seem to have two very different national identities. This individualism also lends itself to the foreign policy analysis theory. The UN and the international community have a difficult task on hand, determining whether Russia's involvement is a case for just war. And ironically, Russia claims that it is the United States that has infringed upon international law. Russia claims its actions were in self-defense of its native population in Ukraine and denies supplying weapons and troops to Russian rebels in the region. However, the uprisings in the east have only increased, even after ceasefire agreements, with suspicious fervency.